I'm sorry Jane has left because I owe her a huge debt of thanks. She's much more organized than I am. And what she has just presented for you is a picture of the way the League works. And if you just re-roll the tape and insert state in wherever she said national, you really would have a picture of how the whole action picture at the New York State level works. It's basically the same process. We start with the grassroots. The conventions are in alternate years. This National League convention just took place. The state convention will be coming up in May, and it will be in Albany. Sometime soon, we will be having a meeting to discuss what we want to recommend as programs for the coming 2 years at the state level. And the state board will evaluate those programs, and they will be discussed and presented at the state convention, and then there will be studies. It's really, I would say, exactly the same procedure, just obviously on a smaller scale. There are 50-some leagues in the state, and I say 50-some because it changes. We actually are gaining leagues where we are always concerned that volunteer organizations are losing members, but seems to be a growth of interest, not surprisingly really, in good government groups in parts of the state which have not had leagues before. So there are some new leagues being organized, so the number is kind of in a state of flux. But the state board is 10 people at the moment, but it's supplemented by a large group of what we call issue specialists. We have a long program list of subjects that we follow at the state level. And in order to keep track of the legislation in these areas, we have people who are specifically interested in those, whether it's pay equity or domestic violence or environmental concerns of various sorts. Issues that we have studied and where we have positions and where we don't want to lose track, but we can't follow everything at once. And so the issue specialists follow the legislation, and if it looks as if there is a bill coming before the legislature which would be particularly relevant to a position that the League has already taken, where they think maybe there really would be some action, then they bring it to the attention of the state board, who decides whether to bring it to the attention of all of the members to provide a basis for advocacy. And that's one thing that Jane didn't mention, so maybe I will spend a few more minutes on that if that's okay. Our advocacy is in several forms. On the spot in Albany, the League has one full-time lobbyist who is in the legislature whenever it's in session. Her name is Barbara Bartoletti, and you'll see her quoted frequently in the Times or any place. She's been a lobbyist for the League for a long time. She is virtually the last unpaid lobbyist in Albany. I mean, it's a killing job, and she does it, as I say, virtually full-time. Almost every other organization which has lobbyists, legislature, in fact, every other organization who have lobbyists, they are paid lobbyists. We do not have any paid lobbyists. We rely on Barbara and a small team, a growing team, we hope, from the Capital District. We're hoping to develop a larger group of a lobby corps. In Washington, there is a staff of paid lobbyists. It's a very small group, 4, I think, paid lobbyists. And they rely on a team of 16 lobbyists who are League members who live in the area surrounding the Capitol and are able to get there. But they're highly organized and trained, and everybody has specific days when they go to places and they are assigned to specific legislators. So it's just as thorough and conscientious as any paid effort, but again, it's not paid. And there again, we are relying on the League members to provide the energy for getting the job done. One of the most interesting things about the way the League works, as far as I'm concerned, is that the issues on which we work do not come and go. Once we have developed a position in support of a particular type of legislation, we stick with it until it becomes a fact, or for some reason becomes irrelevant. But offhand, I can't think of any of those. And we also take on new studies. At the state level, I can give you two illustrations of that, from one extreme to the other. One of the issues on which we are working most diligently right now is the establishment of an independent commission to do the redistricting with the new census figures, to draw the lines for the new congressional districts and for the legislature. I've been a member of the League of Women Voters for nearly 50 years, and the first time I called on a legislator, we were asking for the appointment of an independent commission. We don't give up. Legislators aren't happy with this idea, but we're hoping this year in particular to raise public awareness so that the legislators will see that they just can't keep on doing this the same old way, where they carve their own districts and basically pick their voters rather than the voters picking them. So keep watching. We'll be working on that. The newest issue that we have been studying is one that is really, for us in New York City, not a particularly pressing issue, but as a part of the state organization, we took part in this study also. And that was a study that was adopted at the convention of 2000, whatever that was, 2009, on consolidation of government and shared services. As I said at the time we were discussing it at the state board, I said, you know, in New York City there's not going to be a lot of interest here because we're about as consolidated as you can be, and sharing of services is something that goes on across the 5 boroughs without any hesitation. But this is not the case, as many of you probably know, especially on Long Island and in some of the upstate areas where there are special districts and small villages and a large overlapping in terms of provision of services and the staffing that's required to provide them. And as people are more and more worried about tax levels, they're beginning to think, you know, maybe some of these things that we've held on to with such a devotion are not so wise anymore. So there's been an increasing call for consolidation of governments. And that is something that's regulated by state law. That's what makes it a statewide issue. So we were asked to help develop criteria for laws which would control the decisions being made by local governments which decided they wanted to consolidate or where they were considering sharing of services. And it was a fairly abstract study. It was things like, you know, should the process that is being controlled by this legislation be transparent and fiscally responsible, and a lot of things that seemed like sort of motherhood and apple pie. But on the other hand, you can't just assume them. For example, there was one question which was, should the state provide funding to help districts which think they should consolidate, to do a study to determine whether or not it would be fiscally responsible. And pretty generally, we felt, and other leagues throughout the state felt, yes, the state should help pay for this, because for districts to come up with this on their own might just hold back the process. However, we felt in New York City that these should be matching grants. That the state should put up part of the money and not all of it. Well, the consensus does not mention the matching grants component. And I spoke to the person who wrote the position and said, you know, I happen to matching grants. She said, we went through the reports from all of the leagues, and there was basically a 2/3 threshold. 2/3 of the league supported something, it went into the position. And obviously, there was not two-thirds of the leagues that supported the issue of matching funds. So it's consensus on the whole, where it's a question of consensus. Consensus is spelled C-O-N-S-E-N-S-U-S, not C-E-N. It's not counting, it's thinking together. And so there was obviously, you have to make a decision at some point, well, where are you going to measure consensus when you don't have everybody in the room together? And 2/3 was the threshold that they established, and so that was the cutoff point on that particular position. It's not one that we probably will think about a lot again, because it just doesn't come up. We're not going to be considering that kind of legislation here in New York City itself. But we were participating in this statewide study. So one of the other things that's important at the state level is to choose priorities, partly because it's a spread out and very diverse state, and there are dozens of issues that come up before the legislature every year. It's the League's policy to have issues where we tend to focus most heavily. Not to say that we exclude anything else. If it's on our agenda and it looks as if it's viable, as I say, pay equity and things of that sort, they get considered too. But every year before the legislative session, the State Board establishes priorities where they will focus the greatest amount of attention as far as our lobbying is concerned, and also as far as attracting and spreading information among the membership. Last year, the legislative priorities were put into under the heading, Fix Albany Now. And we had buttons that said Fix Albany Now. I wore my Fix Albany button a lot, and I got stopped everywhere, you know, on street corners and everything. People were saying, you know, how are you going to do that? Get it done quickly, and so on. And there were 4 categories under Fix Albany Now: redistricting, campaign finance reform, ethics reform, and election reform, which last year took the form particularly of changing the application for an absentee ballot so that you didn't have to say what hospital you were going to be in or where you were going on your vacation or anything else. It was what's called no excuse absentee ballot. Pretty much you could say that was accomplished. They did change the application forms for the absentee ballot, so that has been removed from the list. But the very strong likelihood, it's not absolutely firm, but it looks very likely as if we will retain Fix Albany Now or some version of those words, and these 3 major items, redistricting, campaign finance reform, and ethics reform, will continue to be the priorities. The local leagues will be asked if there's anything else that they want to have included, and if there's a strong support for another priority issue, it may very well be added. But we really want to focus on these. We really think that before anything else gets done, first of all, redistricting ought to be done. And if we can't get that, at least there needs to be campaign finance reform. I think most people don't realize how lax the campaign finance regulations in New York State are. New York City has an excellent campaign finance system. New York State is ridiculous. And the limits are, I think it's $50,000 or something like that for an individual contribution to a state legislator. And they can do whatever they want to with the money. I mean, it's really a bad scene. So we are we'll be working on that. And then the ethics reform, we're still needing tougher enforcement and recognition of, even though there have been some improvements in the whole ethics range. So that covers things pretty well. As I say, the rest of the process, as Jane described it, is just the way it works. The state convention is not as big and perhaps not quite as exciting as the national conventions tend to be, but there's a lot that's extremely interesting. And for many of us who are involved at the state level, we see the state government as having a much more direct impact on our daily lives as you get closer and closer to, obviously, city government even more so. But we find the fascination of state government being the fact that there's so much in our daily lives that really is regulated at that level. So I'll be happy to answer questions.